Thanks so much for being here today. It's loud. Okay. I know there are lots of things you could be doing today, and so I'm super grateful that you guys are going to spend an hour with us talking about art. Our format, we're going to have kind of a conversation where we're sort of going to trade our observations of the work, and then we'll open it up for questions in the last 15 minutes or so. So I was talking just before we started with some of the people who are here, and we were talking about the difference of this work in its imagery online and then standing in front of it. And so it's really an incredible backdrop. It's strange to be having the works behind us as we're kind of talking to you guys, but you guys get to look at us, I guess, and look at the work. And so right before we started, I was standing in here and looking at the scale of the objects and the application of the paint, and then I went upstairs and I was looking at the works from that different angle. And so, the first thing that I wanted to kind of throw into the room and to the conversation is the scale of the objects themselves and what it feels like to stand in front of them and not just kind of look at them, but also feel their energy and also smell them. And so the things that you can't get looking at work online are that sense of scale. Even if there's someone, I was looking at the installation views online, and there was like a perfectly posed, probably gallery staff member, right, for size and scale. But being in front of the paintings yourself and deciding like how close you stand to them and what you can see when you're in such close proximity to them, and then standing at a distance and what you see there, and then changing the verticality in terms of the viewpoint, and then also the smell. So those are my first observations of the work.
Yes, I mean, I agree. The gallery sent me images, and I could see the details, but I had no idea what it was going to be like when I first came and stood in front of one of them. One of the things that I guessed I would feel, and that seeing it made me feel like I was right in my hunch, was that these paintings are really a compression of time as well as shapes and forms because of the process. It's so body and so connected to the process of making them. And when you stand with one, you want to spend time with it because it almost becomes like a puzzle. You want to see where this line goes to and how one line goes to the other. So they induce you to spend time with them, not just by the scale, but by the intricacy within that scale.
Yeah, I love the idea of where paintings take you, and the differentiation in the application of line. And so, a lot of these works have the thicker black lines, and then there is sometimes like an outline of the black line in a different color, right? So the work that's in my most immediate view here, for example. So the thicker black line that you see on the far right of the painting that goes from the bottom right up through the kind of center of the canvas to the top, and then it's outlined in yellow along the edge. So there's maybe a conventional line or path, right? So the vertical. But then some of the lines are interrupted, and so that notion of who are you following, right? And how are you being led? And so that kind of push-pull of process, but also destination and journey.
Push-pull is definitely an effect that this artist, Zeng Fanzhi, has gone after. It's very interesting that with the smaller brush strokes, he's actually using two brushes in the hand at the same time. One that he considers the leading brushstroke and the other that he considers the shadow. And so he is himself incorporating into the process almost like this gesture and counter gesture at the same time.
So cool. So Barbara told me she totally prepared, which obviously she did, and I told her I didn't prepare at all. I just wanted to look at the work, and so it's going to be really cool to get that kind of duality of approaches.
Yeah, and
so
For me too, I love people's initial reaction. I mean, I know Chinese art well, but the goal here for any artist is to go beyond Beijing and like to reach audiences all over the world. And so for me, it's really interesting what people's reactions are that aren't necessarily coming from one perspective, but from a global perspective, so that's great.
So one of the things that I was also struck by was the works are clearly abstract, right? And they're clearly gestural. They're filled with energy and momentum and depth and diversity and then the longer I looked, there are a couple of the paintings here with the blue backgrounds that. And I was talking to someone from the gallery earlier who was talking about how these paintings go beyond landscape and how they're like kind of a pinnacle of the landscape practice for the artist. And so I was thinking about that idea of like knowing where you are and then going beyond what you already thought you could do or who you are or what you could know. And so when I'm looking at these three works with the background color primarily being the blue, I was seeing in them some trees. And I didn't necessarily see them originally at this level, but I did when I went upstairs. And I was seeing them as trees with the black trunks and like red flowers maybe, or impressions. And so I wonder if you see that too. Or if after I've suggested it now, you're like, yeah, I see that too.
Well,
or before, yes or no?
I didn't see that before, though it could be. I know, I think with these works, it's open to lots of interpretations. I also saw some kind of shrubbery, but into space behind the trees. Like the blue is like this endless sky behind some shrubbery or trees or anything, or with the red painting over there, I almost felt like I'm looking into some kind of representation of space, deep space. It is kind of amazing that he achieves that sense of layers and moving through space with a two-dimensional canvas.
Yeah, so I'm really big into the both and instead of the either or, right? And so that's come up a couple times already implied in our conversation, and that painting is like a perfect example of that. So, at this distance, it definitely feels like a cosmology, right? And, some kind of sense of the infinite, really. And I love like the detailed photographs of space where, with the natural eye, it looks like it's a dark infinite with like these little tiny, white stars, right? Like everyone's like, oh, I know what space looks like, right? It's like a dark background with white. And then when you're looking at like the recent photographs from the Hubble telescope, and then there are all these other colors there that we can't actually see with our eye. So for me, that painting is about that kind of notion too, or it allows that kind of interpretation because it's both the cosmic, but then it also maybe is like this particular small bit of like my body, right? And like what's happening in there with like the blood and the veins and the cells. And, so it's both like the most massive cosmic infinite and then also the most minute molecular intimate simultaneously.
Absolutely, I would absolutely agree with you. And I think, he has painted landscapes for a long time. But what I'm seeing, not just with Zeng Fanzhi, but with a lot of artists, that where do you bring landscape painting now that we're in the 21st century? And outer space is becoming more and more the way people are thinking about landscape. And so I love the way he envisions that. And I love that you saw trees and a speck on your hand, and at the same time as we can see like universes in it.
Yeah. So it's kind of an exploding notion of landscape, right?
It's definitely an exploding notion of landscape. That I also think what's interesting is that for him, for this artist, for a long time he's been trying to think of what is an imagery that can be seen from wherever you're standing on the globe and be understood. So he did not see himself as like Chinese versus Western artists, though a lot of the artists of his generation did. He already saw himself very much situated within traditions of European painting and also Asian painting. And so I think this is like a crescendo for him in terms of imagery that can be understood by anybody, wherever, whatever culture they're coming from. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such an interesting idea, right? Because a lot of people feel in a broad way that abstraction is not easy to understand, right? People get uncomfortable with abstraction because people want to be able to attach themselves to some idea of concrete meaning. You know, people want to understand, like, okay, this means this. Like, this is an apple, and I know what that tastes like. I know what it smells like. I know what it looks like. So it's quite interesting to think about the artist choosing to, who he previously worked with the figure, and then the figure in the landscape, and then, like, exploding those notions of figuration and abstraction, or in landscape into abstraction, and the idea of, you know, what is universally available. And of course we see abstraction, you know, across culture, and, you know, outside of the art world, abstraction is often seen as something which is harder to understand.
I think right now it's a very interesting moment for abstraction because there was about 10 years ago a lot of abstraction around, but not as challenging as the ones that are surrounding us today in this gallery. And so people got a little tired of abstraction, and now there's been this resurgence of figurative work. And I myself find it really challenging to write about abstraction because, especially with these paintings, the process is, you know, you can make a film of him making this painting and it would be easier than to sit and describe the painting. Yeah.
Okay, so that's great. So how would you describe the painting behind us? Let's all think about that, right?
Yeah.
I'll do it too. I'm not just asking you to do something I won't do too, but yeah, let's do that.
Well, what I think is incredible is that when we're this close to it, every line is actually a chorus of colors. That he has many different colors loaded on his brush at any time, even though it's not a thick brush or a wide brush. With these little brushes that he that are custom made for him, you can see that there's brown with the orange and purple with the blue and red looping through it. And it feels like a tangle, but from across the room, it feels like a cloud. So it feels very lightweight from across the room. Up close, it feels very tangled and dense to me.
You know, it's so...
And you?
Yeah. So one of the things that I love about paintings is that I feel like they reveal themselves to you over time. And an analogy that I often make is a bottle of red wine. And so when you have a bottle of red wine, you decant it because it wants air. And so it changes the way it tastes, you know, based on like how long it's out of the bottle. Because when it's in the bottle, it's like protected from the environment. You know, it doesn't get like dust in there. And then when it's decanted, it slowly kind of expands and allows like a broader welcoming approach, right? And so I feel like painting does that too, particularly abstract painting, where originally, when you first look at it, it's very frontal, and it's sort of like protecting itself from the viewer. Like, okay, do I trust you? Am I going to show you myself? Like, how much of you am I going to show? You know, and then like, the longer you stand there, you're like, okay, so you're interested in me. This is the painting, right? You're interested in me. Like, I'm going to show you a little bit more. I'm going to like reveal a little bit more. I'm going to give you a little bit more. So, and then when you engage with someone else too, you're like, oh, as you're describing it and you're talking about like two brushes in the same hand and the simultaneous like application and the color. And so then I'm seeing more things too, right? So, and then we're in a different position. I was standing in front of it. I looked at it from above. Now I'm kind of looking up at it. And as I'm standing here, I see something that is probably not there, but I'm seeing it, which is this yellow vertical and horizontal, which to me it's looking like a cross, right? And so then I'm like, okay, there's a whole history of art where we have these paintings of like a crucifixion or, you know, so, and again, totally unlikely that it's in the painting, but we all bring our own history of art, our own history of viewing of every other painting that we've looked at before to this moment as well.
Well, it's very interesting because not that long ago, Lockma bought one of his large paintings, and in the catalog they put out, all they talked about was the relationship to calligraphy and to Chinese landscape painting, which I actually don't see that much in it at all. But for them, it was, you know, who owns abstraction? Like, is it a Western thing? Was it invented with calligraphy and Eastern? I mean, for them, it was very important to validate the work by roots in Asian culture. Whereas I think what you're saying is equally valid with the whole idea of the cross or coming out of 20th century abstraction would be equally available to this artist. And it's not like either, as you said, it's not either or, it's and also at the same time.
Yeah. I think also, you know, a painting of this scale, right? Like there's a confidence that comes from being able to paint, you know, at this scale. And then there are the historical associations of this kind of size of a painting. And you know, within the Western tradition, paintings of this scale are often in churches, right? And even the way that, like, you know, this wall is hung, there's like a gradation, so the smallest works are on the outside, and then they get bigger as they come to the center, and then, you know, this work is in the center, and this painting is actually, for me, the most different of all of the paintings here.
This one behind us.
Mm-hmm. You know, because in my description, or like if I was going to give a, you know, formal analysis of it, the brush strokes, let's call them, though they're more like mark making, are the tightest and the most consistent. Mm-hmm. And in the other paintings, there's the ground and like the figure, or so they come out or they recede in. And this for me has the most consistency of the application of the gesture of all the paintings that are here.
But that's interesting. I mean, yeah, I think that's very interesting. There is a fluidity and like a circular gesture that's going on in some of the other works more than in this work. But again, this whole conversation is very different than the way he has been talked about, and I think it's important. You know, this is an artist that one of his earliest experiences is he saw a Rauschenberg show in Beijing in 1985. And he got the idea that art could travel and could communicate things from across the world. And China at that time was a pretty isolated country. And this idea of opening himself up gradually over time to abstraction I mean, it's been a lifetime of painting leading up to him doing works as explosive as these. That is really fascinating to me when you put it in the context of other Chinese artists or where Western abstraction is at right now.
Yeah. So I love your use of the term explosive, and I think that is a super accurate term, and particularly with the painting we were talking about earlier down at the end. And as I was looking at that painting and I was speaking with a woman from the gallery, I asked her if he talks at all about meditation. Because there was something about that particular painting to me which felt not necessarily meditative in terms of how I felt standing in front of it, but something about the way the paint is applied that felt to me like a repetitive practice that meditation evokes. And so that kind of notion of intentional mark making and intentional presence.
Yeah, and this is pretty well known about Zeng Fanzhi, is that he listens to music while he's painting, and often Western opera is what he's listening to while he's painting. But I think the idea of repetitive mark making as a kind of meditative process is really true for him. I am very interested in the comparison between a painting like this one and a Jackson Pollock, for example. And that Jackson Pollock, you couldn't have two people with bigger personality difference than Zeng Fanzhi and Jackson Pollock. This would look like, or that painting looks like, somebody spontaneously pouring it out, spontaneously making these marks, when indeed it is much more of a meditative state. Zeng Fanzhi is as his expression and the personality he evoked is like a Buddha. It's very concentrated. He's been very interested in connoisseurship and knowing the difference between different lines. And for these works, he really did look at abstraction from a number of different painters before he came to this. But the idea that he did it in a meditative way rather than in a drunken, crazy spree is so interesting to me, because we're used to a Western notion of abstraction where it's abstract expressionism, where he is very different than an expressionist, actually.
Yeah, you said something that I'd love to kind of dig into a little bit more as well, which is the meaning or association of the different types of lines.
Yes. I think that in his landscapes, he often had thorns. This gesture of something coming to a point, a thorniness. And I see that in some of these. At the same time, there are lines that are kind of circular, as if he's making a circular motion. The contrast is very interesting to me. It's part of what you picked up on when you said there's a push-pull going on.
Yeah. It comes back to sort of where we started the conversation, which is, where the paintings take us, and then, more specifically, like where the lines take us, and some of it is circuitous, right? And some of it is directional, and some of it is expressive, and each one is thoughtful, right? And so I picked up on that as well, which is that, yes, it looks like something, but it's not that thing. And I make a lot of associations between art and life. It's part of how I think about art. And I really am interested in this notion of how like someone's behavior, for example, may seem like a behavior that you've known before, but if it's coming from a different place or it has a different intention, it's not that thing, it's this other thing. And so, for example, someone might, interact with you in a way that feels familiar, which has a negative association, but it's actually not, even though it seems like it could be, right? And so, but the difference in that, like the space between that, is both the intention of the person who, in this case, is making the mark or making the line, or in that case, the person who's speaking with you, but it's really about us and how we're responding to that, how we're feeling about that, what we're thinking about when that's being offered to us. So as I'm standing in front of these paintings, there's that journey, and there's that suggestion, and there's that opportunity, and each one of the different lines and the colors and the choices are an offer from the artist.
Yeah, yes, very much so. But we're used to an abstraction that comes from emotion, and this is an abstraction that comes very much from an intellectual inquiry. And it's closer to Gerhard Richter's abstractions in a certain way, of kind of use of abstraction not to express deep-seated conflict, psychological conflict, but to reach an audience. It's like a strategy to reach an audience. And I don't mean strategy in a negative way or like a manipulative way, but I'm very interested in the fact that he has gone back and forth between his landscapes, which are kind of like abstraction, and realist, very hyper-realist portraits his whole career in a way that's like Richter's going back and forth between his squeegee paintings and his history paintings. And so it's a very smart use of abstraction. Rather than an emotional outpouring.
Your response made me sad.
Why?
Because I think emotions are smart too, Like I think an emotional response is smart too,
Oh,
and
okay, this is just me.
Yeah. So, but it's interesting, right? Like the idea of being strategic, right, about expression or abstraction, and that's not, it's not necessarily bad, right?
No, I didn't mean it.
No, I know. Yeah, and but it's interesting, right? Because like we all get to make choices, right? Like we get to choose like what it is what we share, what we don't share, what we bring forward, what we say, and yeah, of course, I guess. Everyone's strategic, right? Like I thought about what I was going to wear today because I'm like sitting, like in a chair in front of other people, right? So playing with that, and so moving back and forth between figuration and abstraction, yeah, strategic for sure. I get it.
Or thoughtful, maybe a better word. Or I think it's. I think that one of the reasons I got very interested in Chinese art was not because I was a huge fan of calligraphy or classical painting, but because artists in China are situated in a very interesting place in terms of, like, American artists working in abstraction inherit a legacy and assume a certain power that comes from generation, a history of that. A Chinese artist using abstraction is very much having to think about what part of it comes from their own culture and what part of it is negotiating other cultures, and how do you express that tension to your audience. And that is a very, very intriguing puzzle to me. Because, for example, he studied Cézanne, then he studied Van Gogh, he studied the use of line from post-impressionism through abstract expressionism before he came to making these paintings. And that kind of survey study, and you see it in the development of his work, shows that it isn't like he woke up one day and said, this is my line. He studied many other artists' lines before coming to what would be his line. And so I guess strategy sounds more manipulative, but thoughtfulness is, an intellectual approach to line is very fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, so a couple things in there. That the idea of like an in-depth study of other people's lines, you know, I think is super interesting. And then using that study as a way of like decoding, right? Like these lines. And then being able to identify like this line comes from this artist or this line comes from this artist. So like constructing like a dance or a sentence, you know, from pre-existing expressions is quite interesting. And the other point that you made, which I think is really important, is like the specific context in which the artist is working. And it's not necessarily accessible to an American audience, right? And so, for example, a friend of mine is working for a Chinese institution and is mentoring the next generation of curators. And he was sharing that they're putting together exhibitions which have cultural commentary within the selection of the works that are invisible to a Western eye, but are super available, though veiled, to a Chinese audience.
Right.
And so like the kind of interplay of like who understands what and what points are being made by those choices. And even when it's explained, you know, maybe to his Western eye, he believes her, right? Because she's like showing what it is, but he doesn't have the vocabulary or the background to see it himself. And so, you know, that's quite interesting and important to underscore.
Yeah, and what I find very exciting is that there's a whole new generation that he's dealing with of young Chinese critics and curators coming up that are going to present us with a whole new look to Chinese contemporary art. Zeng Fanzhi is certainly an international artist, so it's not like, but I'm saying he didn't get there just by a popularity contest. He also put thought into questions that always intrigued me. When I was a kid, I was really intrigued why Starry Night was the one painting that everybody went to see at MoMA. Like, is it in the painting, or is it the popularity of the painting, or is it that we've seen it a million times, or that Mona Lisa is the universally known, we assume the universally known icon of the Louvre? These are kind of questions that artists from other cultures have had to give a lot of thought to in terms of reaching global audiences. And it's very intriguing what we assume to be universal and what other people have had to do in terms of achieving universal recognition. And yeah, it's just very intriguing to me.
Yeah.
Should we open it up to questions, or?
Not quite yet.
Oh, all right.
But I'm glad that I can see there are a couple of questions.
Yeah.
So we will go there. We will go there shortly.
All right. Sorry.
No. It's okay. I can see the time. So.
I can't. That's right.
Yeah. So let's talk about the drawings because we haven't talked about the drawings yet, and you know, you had shared earlier that he doesn't make drawings in advance of the painting. So these drawings are not like preparatory images for the paintings. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the drawings.
I think it's interesting that he did the drawings as kind of a parallel to the paintings, not as preparatory for the paintings. And again, I think it's him working out what the line is going to be. And we often think of drawing or line as something as easy as our signature. But artists actually put a lot of thought into developing what that line is going to be. And so I'm intrigued. I would have to see a lot more than these, but they're beautiful and they're fascinating to me. I had not seen a lot of his drawing before. I had seen drawing within the paintings. But and with his paintings where there's a portrait or something, there's a lot of drawing going on within the painting. But I had not seen a lot of works on paper before, so this was fascinating for me.
Yeah. So from here, one of the things that I think is quite interesting is how much of the paper is covered and where it's not white space because the paper's not white, but where the absence of mark making is, and they are quite explosive. To circle back to that term, and the energy that's collating in the different parts of the work, I think really emphasizes some of the things that we've talked about. So when you're standing in front of the paintings, they're so different. If you choose to focus on like a small section versus pulling back, and I feel like the drawings are again kind of another key to how to look at the paintings. So one of the other things I wanted to just kind of emphasize about the painting. Oh, yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to say also what's really interesting in the drawings is that it's not clear where the focal point is. It's not like there's a horizon line. I mean, I think with all of the works that he's doing recently, the idea of eliminating the horizon line is very important to see. It's hard to know where to look, where to start your looking, and where to end your looking when you engage with those drawings.
Yeah, that's a super interesting point too, right? So because of the all-over nature of the drawings and the paintings, you really do have the opportunity to choose like where you want to start and where you want to end, right? And so how long you want your duration to be and what you might pick up on, and so in the monochromatic areas of the paintings, like the yellow, the blue, the yellow, the blue over here, there's a little bit of impasto. So not a lot of it. So it's not like it's super built up, but there's like the residue of the application of the paint. And so it looks as if the application method is different. And so there's like a stickiness to it, which I think emphasizes the flatness. And it's very different than some of the other ways that the paint is implied.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't talked about texture, and the texture of these paintings, they're not, like when I got the photographs of the painting, I could not really appreciate how it feels next to them and how much it's like, almost like fabric or strings being tangled together on the surface of these paintings. And and then the background is also built up. So, I mean, I think it's very interesting.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in the brain and what parts of the brain we activate, and then how to activate the other parts of the brain that we don't. And so there is for me that kind of notion of the firings of the neurons happening in these works, and one of the ways to activate the other parts of your brain is sonically. And so the fact that he's making these paintings while he's listening to music, and then, what part of the music is activating which part of the brain that's then causing which part of the brain to make the gesture or the mark making, and that kind of circularity, I feel in the presence of these works.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. There is definitely, when we talk about, it could be an expansive universe or it could be going inside our heads. I mean, it's absolutely true about these paintings.
So I asked you if any of these paintings have titles, and you're like, no. Or if they do have titles, then there's something like, Series D53. And so I was like, okay, well, that's not like that helpful.
It made
right?
it difficult to write about.
Yeah. But then I was thinking about like, okay, well, what is like D53, certainly being at the Frieze Art Fair, you're like, okay, it's like playing Scrabble. It's like A5, I'll meet you at like, A5, or so D53, but that's like how we also describe like DNA sequencing, or, so there are, references, I think, potentially to science as well.
Oh, maybe. I think it was very important for him not to have associations with, like, poetic associations or emotional associations. So I think that's why he, this time around, did not use titles. Soon.
Okay, now we're ready for some questions. And you're right in my view plane, and yes, ma'am. So I was going to start with you, because I could see you're taking notes. And
yeah, I was.
Yeah.
I was. Is this coming on?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I've had a lot of thoughts as you've been speaking. One is the difference in this black, more monochromatic painting as opposed to the two other, what I might say, categories. One being this very heavily textured tangle almost, where you can't penetrate it, similar to the one at the end. Those would be one area. The other is the very more figurative ground. But this one being so different in coloration, and with a horizon line and quite a bit of figure ground. I mean, whether the associations are coming from my back interpretation or whether it was intentional, I guess doesn't matter if that's what the viewer sees. But I find it very interesting, and I think holding a lot of emotional impact, whether that came from the artist or, once again, is associative on my part.
That's actually so astute of you, because that painting is the closest to his previous landscape paintings in terms of all the paintings here, and I'm sitting with my back to it, so I didn't necessarily think about it all the time when I was talking. But for many years, he has done landscape paintings with that coloration, where he starts with a horizon line and then makes markings on top of it. So it almost looks like a lantern behind a sand dune, or light peeking out, like moonlight peeking out behind trees or something. And this one is the one that I think is closest to the landscape painting, and is a place to start in terms of entering the paintings in this room.
Light coming out of the dark, behind the darkness, light shining through.
Yeah, there's a smaller painting on the second floor, which I think has an affinity with this painting as well. Its palette is similar, and I think there's something about that, about the palette, which does feel like an emerging light. And so whether that's like a cosmic emerging light, or whether that's like, as you're saying, like an emerging light, like out of the darkness, and like the clearing.
Thank you. So just to address a little bit of what Heidi spoke about, how we approach art with our own interpretation and our own understanding of what we've been exposed to. I want to comment on that or acknowledge that. In these pieces, initially I saw little Cy Twombly, a little Bryce Martin, when we started talking about the line work and the way he uses his painting or his brushes. I saw Bryce Martin. And then you started looking from a landscape quality, and they have resonance of Sean Cavanaugh, who is the grandson of Milton Avery, and very reminiscent of his pieces. But the question I have is, does he paint simultaneously multiples, or is he focused on one piece at a time? Because I'd like to see how those ideas translate and bounce off, because I can see a very fluid relationship, and that's kind of indicative of someone who's working on multiple pieces simultaneously. So do you know if he works on them to completion singularly, or is he working on them simultaneously?
Oh, I actually don't know the answer to that. I actually don't know the answer to that. Maybe, do you?
Where he actually works simultaneously, sometimes in the studio in the morning on abstraction and moves to figuration. That's another practice. He works wet on wet, so he works quite quickly. So if he works on a painting, he kind of works quite rapidly and sticks to one work. But it's really interesting that you say this. I think he likes to bounce between works, and there's definitely kind of a sense of a gesture that goes through them all. Yeah.
Also, what I thought was like, this is the kind of thing that really intrigues me. You say you see Cy Twombly and Bryce Martin. Well, both of them studied calligraphy to come up with their line. So we've now reached this point that is actually hope for humanity, in my view, where Chinese artists get mistaken for having marks from Western artists who also got their ideas from Asian art and back again, where there's this like conversation going on that is so much more representative of where contemporary art can go than divisiveness, that it makes me happy to think about those things. Yeah.
Question for Barbara. You've played such an interesting role as a critic, interpreting all of the new work, the contemporary art that came out of such a key period, and I'm just wondering about like the what you mentioned in your remarks just now about. For example, Zeng and other artists of his generation having learned so much and been influenced by that one exhibition, that Rauschenberg exhibition in 1985. And yet, as you know, those of us who came to our art practices or our historical knowledge within the context of the U.S., like we know that, right, there was a whole context around Rauschenberg. And scenes and other people and all of that. So I guess the two questions I have for you is just, what was your experience in maybe running into really interesting and maybe unexpected interpretations on the side of Chinese artists in having only a partial, exposure to these, figures like Rauschenberg, maybe even being in a position of filling in some of the picture for some people. There's that, and then just I want to fast forward to now. How do you see your role as like a transcontextual critic in the present? Now that we have this like 3 years of really curtailed exchange and not as many people going back and forth and so forth.
Okay, both of those are two huge questions. One is, I just was struck that when I went to China in the early 2000s, many artists mentioned to me that Rauschenberg show. I also suspect, though I don't know for a fact, that Zeng Fanzhi probably also saw around the same time in China a Zhao Wuqi show that was almost at the same time in Beijing, and Zhao Wuqi was a Chinese artist who had moved to Paris and is credited with being the first to combine Eastern and Western markings in a kind of abstraction. So I think that may have planted a seed in his brain too. But different Chinese artists had wildly different interpretations of what the Rauschenberg show meant to them. And also, Zeng Fanzhi is 10 years younger than other artists who emerged in the 1990s, like, that we would know, like Fang Lijun or Wang Guanyi or Zhang Zhanggang. These other people who emerged, or Saiko Chung or Ai Weiwei who emerged, they're 10 years older than him. So I think what he took away from the Rauschenberg show was just the fact that there was a world beyond Beijing. I mean, I think that is a big thing. I think that made a big impression on him. But other artists absolutely wanted to imitate Rauschenberg, or at the same time, around the same time of the Rauschenberg show, the only way artists were finding out about the West, because this is pre-internet, was people bringing in catalogs or magazines, and they weren't even translated into Chinese. So there was a lot of absorption of images where people didn't know. And they learned, what's so interesting is that they learned art history in a non-linear order. So you got a catalog of Rembrandt painting one day, and then you got an art forum the next day. And you see Chinese artists adopting imagery and iconography as a way of learning for themselves what art history could be. In addition to getting their whole training in Chinese academies in realist painting, which is mainly what they were learning. For me, I view myself as hopefully being obsolete really quickly, because I'm meeting more and more critics and curators from China who are in their 30s, who are, like, when I came to China in 2004, there were not that many people writing about Chinese art, and the institutions in China were not doing research into contemporary art. They did not view themselves as research institutions. And so a handful of people from Europe and the United States wound up writing a lot. We're passé now. You know, we're not needed anymore. And I think that's great. That gives me a lot of hope for the future, and I want to see what the next generation is bringing.
Final question? Anyone want to have the last word? Thank you so much for choosing to spend an hour with us today, and thank you so much for Hauser Wirth for hosting us, and to the Frieze Art Fair for putting this on. It's so important that we have dialogues around contemporary art from all over the globe, and super grateful to everyone here today and to the gallery and to the art fair for facilitating these conversations. So, Barbara, super fun to be in conversation.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.